He had $11 left, and one shot to save his daughter's future. What happened next? Nobody saw coming. We don't fund garage projects here. One sentence, one rejection. She had no idea what she was about to lose. 3 days. That's all it took for her entire empire to come crashing down, and only he could save it. The machine that could save her billion-dollar launch was built by the very man she threw out 3 days ago. She rejected him without a second thought. Now watch what happens when the man she dismissed saves everything she built. Daniel Reyes had exactly $11 in his checking account and one shot left to save his daughter's future. And he knew it the moment he stepped off the elevator on the 40th floor of Coldwell Tower. If you have ever stood in a lobby so polished, you could see your own exhaustion reflected in the marble floor, you already understand the particular kind of fear that was crawling up his spine. If this story moves you even a little, do one thing for me before you keep reading. Tap that like button and subscribe to the channel. Because stories like this deserve to be shared with people who still believe in second chances. Now let's go back to the beginning. 3 years earlier, Daniel had been a lead mechanical engineer at a mid-sized manufacturing firm. The kind of quiet genius who could listen to a machine hum and tell you exactly which bearing was 2 weeks from failure. Then his wife, Maria, was diagnosed with an aggressive illness that ate through their savings faster than the disease ate through her body. He worked double shifts, sold the car, sold his tools one by one, and held her hand every night until the night she stopped squeezing back. When she was gone, Daniel was left with a 7-year-old daughter named Lily, a stack of medical bills that followed him like a shadow, and a hole in his chest that never fully closed. He did what any father would do. He got smaller jobs, fixed appliances in the neighborhood, repaired cars in his cousin's garage on weekends, and spent every spare hour designing a self-regulating hydraulic valve system that could cut industrial energy waste by nearly 40%. An idea born not from ambition, but from necessity, because it was the one thing he had left that was entirely his own. He believed, the way only a desperate and brilliant man can believe, that this single invention could change everything for him and Lily. That belief was what brought him to Coldwell Tower on a gray Tuesday morning, wearing his one good shirt, carrying a battered folder of blueprints under his arm like it was a shield. Coldwell Industries was the largest manufacturing conglomerate on the West Coast, and its CEO, Vanessa Cole, had built it from her late father's failing company into a billion-dollar empire through sheer will and an almost frightening intolerance for weakness. She was 42, sharp-eyed, immaculately composed, and famous in industry circles for never once, in 11 years as CEO, changing her mind in a meeting. Daniel had spent 6 months getting this 15-minute pitch slot. He had practiced in the mirror, practiced in the car, practiced while Lily brushed her teeth beside him at the sink, her toothbrush bobbing in time with his sentences like she was cheering him on without knowing it. When he finally stood in the glass-walled boardroom, flanked by junior executives who barely looked up from their tablets, he laid out his blueprints with hands that would not stop trembling, not from nerves, but from hunger, because he had skipped breakfast to save the bus fare for a taxi that would get him there on time. Vanessa Cole did not stand up to greet him. She remained seated at the head of the table, scrolling through something on her phone, and when she finally looked up, her eyes moved over him the way you might glance at a stain on a tablecloth. Noted, dismissed, forgotten. "You have 8 minutes," she said. "Not 15. I have somewhere to be," Daniel began anyway. He explained the valve mechanism, the energy savings, the return on investment within 18 months, the patents pending. He was good, better than good. And for a moment, one of the junior engineers actually leaned forward, intrigued, but Vanessa's face did not move. When he finished, breathless and hopeful, there was a silence so long it felt like a verdict already delivered. "This is a hobbyist's sketch dressed up as an engineering proposal," she finally said, her voice flat and precise as a scalpel. We don't fund garage projects here, Mr. Reyes. We fund proven technology from proven teams. You don't have a team. You don't have a lab. You don't even have a company. What you have is a folder and a story, and I don't invest in stories. Daniel felt the room tilt. He thought of Lily's worn-out sneakers, of the eviction notice folded in his jacket pocket, of the 3 days grace period the landlord had reluctantly given him. He tried once more, his voice cracking slightly. Ms. Cole, I know how this looks, but I built this system myself, tested it myself, and it works. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for a chance to prove it in your facility, even a small pilot line. Please, I have a daughter, and Mr. Reyes. Vanessa cut him off without raising her voice, which was somehow worse than shouting. Personal circumstances are not a business case. I'm not in the business of pity investments. My assistant will show you out. She turned back to her phone before he had even gathered his blueprints, and the junior executives, taking their cue from her, went back to their screens as if he had already left the room, even though he was still standing there, folder shaking in his hands. He walked out past the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a city that had never felt so large and so indifferent. And in the elevator going down, alone, he allowed himself exactly 40 seconds to cry before wiping his face and reminding himself that Lily was waiting at his sister's apartment and needed him to walk in with his head up, no matter what had just happened 40 floors above. That night, Daniel sat on the edge of his sister Carmen's pull-out couch, listening to Lily's soft breathing in the next room, and made a decision. He would not chase Coldwell Industries again. He would take the smaller commercial contract he'd been putting off, repairing outdated hydraulic presses for a struggling regional bottling plant. Work far beneath his real talent, but steady enough to keep a roof, any roof, over his daughter's head. Pride, he told himself, was a luxury for men who hadn't buried their wives. He signed the contract the next morning. 3 days after Vanessa Cole had dismissed him like a stain on a tablecloth, chaos broke out 60 miles away at Coldwell Industries' flagship manufacturing plant, the one producing the prototype units for a revolutionary new line of medical oxygen concentrators the company had spent 2 years and $11 million developing. It was set to launch in 9 days, with a press event already scheduled, hospital pre-orders already signed, and Vanessa's own reputation staked publicly on its success. That morning, the plant's primary hydraulic compression system seized without warning, a custom-built unit so specialized that only its original design engineer fully understood its architecture. And that engineer had quietly resigned 2 years earlier after a bitter dispute with senior leadership over safety corners being cut, taking his documentation with him out of spite. Every certified technician Coldwell flew in, took one look at the seized system, and shook their head. 2 claimed it would take 3 weeks to source replacement parts. 1 said the entire unit might need to be scrapped and rebuilt from scratch. An 8-figure setback that would blow the launch date and, worse, the hospital contracts that depended on it. Vanessa stood on the factory floor in her heels, watching a production line worth more than most people's lifetime earnings sit dead silent. And for the first time in 11 years as CEO, she felt something close to panic clawing up her throat. It was her head of operations, a quietly observant man named Thomas Ibarra, who remembered something. Months earlier, before the pitch meeting fiasco, Tomas had reviewed Daniel Reyes's technical file during initial vetting and had been genuinely impressed. Impressed enough that he'd kept the folder. He also happened to know, through an old contact at the bottling plant, that the same rare valve architecture in Daniel's rejected proposal shared its core logic with the very compression system now sitting dead on Coldwell's factory floor. It was a long shot, born of desperation rather than confidence. But Thomas made the call anyway, not mentioning to Daniel who exactly was asking, only that a manufacturing company urgently needed emergency consulting and would pay triple his usual rate, cash on delivery. Daniel almost said no. He was exhausted. His hands ached from 2 straight days at the bottling plant, and Lily had a school event that evening he'd promised not to miss. But triple rate, paid same day, was 3 weeks of breathing room he could not afford to refuse. He told Carmen he'd make it up to Lily, kissed his daughter's forehead before she left for school, and drove 2 hours in a borrowed truck to an address he did not recognize, until he was already walking through the front doors and saw the name Coldwell Industries etched in, brushed steel above the reception desk. His stomach dropped, but his rent was due in 3 days, and pride, again, was a luxury. He was led onto the factory floor still wearing his work boots and grease-stained jacket, and the first person he saw was Vanessa Cole, standing exactly where she had been for the better part of 6 hours, arms crossed, jaw tight, watching her company's entire future sit motionless in front of her. Their eyes met across the factory floor, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. She recognized him instantly. He recognized her. Somewhere behind her, Tomas Ibarra shifted uncomfortably, silently praying this wouldn't blow up before it had even started. "You," Vanessa said, and it was not a greeting. "Me," Daniel replied simply, and instead of turning around and walking back out, which some smaller, more wounded part of him desperately wanted to do, he set down his bag, walked directly to the seized compression unit, crouched beside it, and began running his hands along the housing the way another man might read Braille. He asked for the maintenance logs. He asked when the last recalibration had occurred. He asked, very specifically, whether the secondary pressure valve had ever been swapped for a non-original part. And when the floor supervisor's face went pale, Daniel nodded slightly, because he already had his answer. "Give me 4 hours," he said, not looking at Vanessa. "And I need my own tools. The ones your technicians used are the wrong gauge for this housing. That's part of why it's stuck." Vanessa wanted to refuse. Every instinct that had built her empire told her not to hand over 4 unsupervised hours on an $11 million production line to a man she had personally, publicly humiliated 3 days earlier. But Thomas caught her eye and gave the smallest nod, the kind that said, "Trust me." And beneath her composed exterior, Vanessa Cole was, for once in her adult life, completely out of better options. 3 hours, she said. "And I'm staying right here." She did stay the entire time, close enough to watch, but far enough to stay out of his way. And something began to shift in her the longer she observed him work. This was not a man fumbling with a hobbyist's sketch. This was a man who spoke to machinery the way a doctor speaks to a patient. Methodical, patient, occasionally muttering technical corrections to himself under his breath, ignoring the sweat soaking through his shirt and the ache visibly building in his shoulders. At the 2-hour mark, he asked for a part that didn't exist in their inventory. Then, without complaint, disassembled a component from an older backup unit in the corner and modified it by hand on a workbench, filing it down with a precision that made even the senior technicians go quiet and watch. At 3 hours and 11 minutes, the compression system shuddered, hissed, and came back online with a low, steady hum that sounded, to everyone standing on that floor, like the most beautiful sound in the world. The production line lights flickered green, one by one, down the entire assembly floor. Somewhere, a technician actually cheered. Vanessa Cole did not cheer. She stood very still, watching the man she had dismissed as a garage hobbyist single-handedly save 9 days, $11 million, and a launch that hundreds of hospitals were counting on. "How?" she finally asked, her voice quieter than Daniel had ever heard it. "Did you know exactly what was wrong with the system you'd never seen before you walked in here today?" Daniel wiped his hands on a rag, exhaustion finally showing on his face, and looked at her directly for the first time since she'd dismissed him in that boardroom. "Because it's built on the same core valve logic as the system I tried to show you 3 days ago. The one you called a hobbyist's sketch. I designed that architecture from scratch, Ms. Cole. Nobody handed it to me. I built it in a garage at night after my daughter went to sleep because it was the only thing I had left to give her a better life. You didn't reject a sketch. You rejected the reason your production line is running again, right now." The factory floor went completely silent. Vanessa Cole, who had not lost an argument in a boardroom in over a decade, had absolutely nothing to say. She looked at the folder Thomas was quietly holding, the same folder Daniel had brought into her boardroom 3 days earlier, and for the first time she actually opened it herself instead of dismissing it from a distance. Flipping through pages of calculations, stress tests, and patent filings that, in the panic of that morning, she had never actually bothered to read. That evening, instead of letting Daniel leave with his payment and his bruised pride intact, Vanessa asked him to stay for one more conversation, in private, away from the factory floor and away from the audience of employees who had witnessed her, humbled in real time. She did not apologize immediately. That was not in her nature yet. But she asked him questions, real questions, about his design, his background. The years he'd spent as a lead engineer before his wife's illness derailed everything. She listened, this time, actually listened, in a way she hadn't 3 days earlier, and somewhere in that hour-long conversation, something in her rigid worldview quietly cracked open. "I was wrong," she finally said, and the words seemed to cost her something physical to say out loud. "Not just about the system, about you. I looked at a man in a worn jacket asking for help and decided he had nothing to offer me, when he had exactly what my company needed, and I was too arrogant to see it. That's not a mistake I make often, Mr. Reyes, and I don't intend to make it twice." Daniel didn't need her apology to survive, but hearing it did something to the tight knot he'd been carrying in his chest since that boardroom door had closed behind him 3 days earlier. "I didn't come here for an apology," he said honestly. "I came here because I needed to make rent by Friday. But I'll take it anyway." What happened over the following weeks surprised almost everyone at Coldwell Industries, including Vanessa herself. She didn't simply pay Daniel his consulting fee and let him disappear back into obscurity the way a smaller, more embarrassed executive might have. She personally reviewed his original hydraulic valve proposal, brought it in front of the same board that had watched her dismiss him, and this time presented it herself, unflinchingly acknowledging that she had nearly let her own arrogance cost the company one of the most promising efficiency innovations in a decade. The board approved a full pilot program within a week, with Daniel not as an outside contractor but as lead design consultant, his name on the patent filings alongside the company's, and a salary that made Carmen cry when he told her. For Lily, the changes came more simply and more sweetly. No more counting coins for the school lunch line. No more patched sneakers held together with Daniel's own careful stitching. A real apartment with a real bedroom that was entirely hers, painted the pale yellow she'd been asking for since her mother passed. Daniel picked her up from school himself now, most days, in a car that wasn't borrowed, and some evenings, Vanessa Cole, who had somehow, almost without either of them planning it, become a fixture at the pilot lab where Daniel now worked, would still be there when he arrived, going over test data with an intensity Daniel recognized because it mirrored his own. Their relationship never became the stuff of tabloids or grand romantic declarations. Both of them had built their entire adult lives around discipline and survival, and neither knew quite how to be anything other than careful. But slowly, over shared coffee during late-night testing sessions, over Vanessa quietly showing up to one of Lily's school science fairs because Daniel mentioned it in passing, and she remembered, over Daniel teaching Vanessa, the billionaire CEO who had never once used a wrench in her life, how to properly torque a bolt on the very valve system that had changed both their lives. Something real and unhurried took root between two people who had both, in different ways, forgotten what it felt like to be seen clearly by another person. 6 months after that gray Tuesday morning in the boardroom, Coldwell Industries' new energy-efficient hydraulic line launched to industry acclaim, credited publicly as the Reyes Coal Efficiency System, cutting operational energy waste across 3 manufacturing plants by exactly the margin Daniel had promised in a folder Vanessa had once called a hobbyist's sketch. At the launch event, standing at a podium she had built entirely on her own terms for over a decade, Vanessa Cole did something she had never done in any prior product launch. She stepped aside from the center of the stage and gestured for Daniel to stand beside her, in front of cameras, investors, and hospital representatives whose patients would soon breathe easier because of a system he'd designed at night. In a garage, for a daughter who was in the audience that day, wearing a new yellow dress, clapping louder than anyone in the room. "This system exists," Vanessa told the crowd, her voice steady but unmistakably sincere, "because a man I once turned away without listening refused to stop believing in what he'd built, even after I gave him every reason to give up. I learned something that day I hope none of you ever have to learn the hard way, that the person standing in front of you asking for a chance might already hold the answer you desperately need. Look closer before you decide someone has nothing to offer. Sometimes the person you almost dismissed is the only one who can save everything you've built." Daniel didn't say much at the podium that day. He didn't need to. He found Lily's eyes in the crowd, gave her a small nod, and felt, for the first time since Maria had passed, that the ground beneath his feet was finally solid again. Not because a billionaire had rescued him, but because he had never once stopped building, even when no one else believed there was anything worth building at all. Later that night, after the cameras had gone and the crowd had thinned out, Daniel sat on the front steps of the venue with Lily curled against his side, her new yellow dress rumpled from a day of excitement, and watched the city lights flicker on, one by one, across the skyline. Vanessa found them there, 2 coffee cups in hand, and sat down on the step below without a word. The three of them quiet together for a long moment in a way that felt more honest than anything said at the podium that afternoon. Lily eventually broke the silence by asking Vanessa, with the blunt curiosity only a 7-year-old possesses, whether she was going to keep coming around now. And Vanessa, a woman who had spent 11 years never allowing herself to be caught off guard in public, laughed for the first time that whole day and said she certainly hoped so. 3 days. That was all it had taken for everything to change. Not because fortune had simply smiled on him, but because he had refused to let one closed door convince him he had nothing left to offer the world. And somewhere in that lesson is the quiet truth this story leaves behind. Never let someone else's rejection become the final verdict on your worth, because the very thing you were told didn't matter might one day be the exact thing someone desperately needs. Sometimes the door that slams in your face isn't the end of the story at all. It's simply the hallway you had to walk through to reach the one that was built for you.